Good afternoon and welcome to today's book club gathering. My name is Lorna Cron. I am the Secretary of Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland, and I would like to introduce you to her guest, Mary W. Graig, with notes that I've shamelessly pinched from her website and her books. Mary is a writer and historian living and working in Scotland. She is a former Craigie scholar and a Glasgow University graduate. Describing herself as a historical magpie, which I completely relate to, her particular interest is in the men and women accused as witches in the 17th century. Mary also hosts a podcast with Dan Swan called The Borders Bletherings, where they explore the curious and shadowy and magical history of the Scottish borders. Today, Mary joins us to talk about her book, Agnes Finnie, The Witch of the Potter Row Port. During the 17th century, when witch hunts were a daily occurrence, if a woman was arrested and accused of being a witch, she could be tried and usually found guilty in a matter of days, even hours. This was not the case of Agnes, a working woman living in the tenements of Edinburgh. Her whole trial was unusual. It took months of deliberation from the trial that eventually led to Agnes's burning. So I'm now going to hand you over to Mary. Thank you very much, Mary.
Oh, thank you for that introduction, and I hope everybody can hear me correctly. Yell at me if you can't. So yes, Agnes Finnie. People often ask me why I wrote the book about Agnes Finnie, because they sort of read the book, or they might know a little bit about Agnes, because I know that there are a couple of the guides in Edinburgh do walks and talks about Agnes, and they'll say the problem is that Agnes Finnie was not a nice person. She was a bad-tempered old so-and-so, so why on earth would I write a book about a bad-tempered old so-and-so? But that's the very reason I wanted to. There's been a lot of discussion around witches and witchcraft and the persecution of women and men as witches in the 17th century. And the vast number of people that are talking about this and are involved in this do it for absolutely the best of reasons, but sometimes they don't quite have an understanding of what we mean by the word witch. And that can mean 101 different things. Often people will think of witches as sweet little old ladies out in the countryside gathering herbs to take care of children, and they were. Some of them alleged, were red-haired and green-eyed and left-handed, and some of them were. But also, some of them were ordinary people. In fact, all of them were ordinary women and men. Some may have thought of themselves as witches. Some may not. Some might have been called witches by the community. Some may have not. Some were branded witches by the church, but they meant people that followed the devil, which the vast, vast majority of people in Scotland did not do. And so it's really easy to be sympathetic to a sweet old lady gathering herbs, or a young girl who's just trying to make her way in the world as a healer or a charmer. It's a lot more difficult to be sympathetic to a character who's a bit annoying and a bit of a pain in the tonsils and is a bit crabbit and falls out with all of her neighbours. But that's why Agnes is important, because all of the women and men who were arrested, tried, convicted, and the vast majority executed were normal, ordinary Scots. They should never have been arrested. They should never have been submitted to that torture. They should never have been executed in the way they were. I don't care if they were actually doing spells to turn their neighbours into toads. Nobody ever actually did that. But that's the point, is that Agnes was ordinary, like you or me, and she should have had natural justice, like you and I, and she should have been innocent until proven guilty. And she wasn't, and that was the tragedy. The tragedy was that the Kirk of Scotland became so zealous in their beliefs that they dragged the law along with them. And the good, the bad, and the ugly all ended up in the justice system when they should not have done so. So that's why I wanted to write Agnes's story, because she was just ordinary. But I also wanted to write Agnes's story because people will often say to me things like, we've read one of your books or we've heard one of your talks, and somebody will say, oh, I've been a witch for 20 years or 30 years. And they would say, why would any neighbourhood tolerate a witch for 20 or 30 years? And it's because witches actually were a good thing. They were part of their communities. So if we look at Agnes, she was probably born, we're not quite sure, maybe around 1590. So you're coming into the 17th century. We've already got John Knox. Now, as I say, I don't know what was wrong with John Knox. I don't know if maybe his mammy didn't give him enough cuddles when he was growing up. But whatever it was, he didn't like women. All women were sinful, all women were awful, all women were potential witches, and power was unnatural to women. So women who had power had to have it from an unnatural source like the devil. So John Knox has taken the Church of Scotland, the kirk as it was starting, and he's pushed it in that direction, which is fine. You've got politics and chaos and religion and chaos and everything going on in the background. And then you've got Agnes Finnie, growing up in the Potterrow Port in Edinburgh, in tenements where ordinary people lived, where we would probably, if we'd been alive then, we would have lived those sorts of lives. Why did the people put up with Agnes? Because there was nobody else. Because there was no doctor for the poor. If your child was ill, you go to Agnes. She might be a pain in the tonsils, she might be a crab old so-and-so, but there's no one else for you to go to. If you can't pay your rent, you can't go to the bank. They're not going to let the likes of you in the door. So the only person you can borrow money from is Agnes. You might not like her shop. She might be really rude and cause arguments all the time, but there isn't another shop to go to because you're the poor of Edinburgh in a tenement, and that's the same as the poor in Glasgow or Dundee or Aberdeen or right the way across the country. And that's the thing. The church was obsessed with the devil and thought that all witches were enthralled to the devil. The witches that lived in communities were predominantly ordinary women who were Christian, who had some magical powers that may have come to them from the fairies or from their mother or from their grandmother who'd got it from the fairies, and they were doing good. Now, there were people who were known as charmers, and they could give you a love charm if you wanted a nice fella. There were people who were known as healers, and you would go to them if your child was ill. And there were people who were known as witches. And all three of those terms are sort of interchangeable. There were people who were called witches by the church that had never called themselves that, but it didn't matter. These were individuals that provided a service for their community, and it might be healing a child, it might be lending you money, it might be giving you a love potion for your boyfriend, or it might just be providing you a shop that actually sold you goods. So that was the world that Agnes was living in. But unfortunately for Agnes, she happened to be alive at the time when Charles I had decided to spectacularly fall out with his parliament, and the two of them are screaming and bawling and shouting at each other. Charles wanted more money from the parliament wanted more power from Charles. They ended up at loggerheads. So Charles threw all his toys out the pram, went to his advisors and said, I need money, the parliament won't give me it, tell me where I can get money. And they looked back in the records and they found all of the medieval rights that a king had. So Charles was able to raise the money, raise the taxes on salt. Without refrigeration, you need salt or your food goes bad. So the poor in the Potterrow in Edinburgh, the poor of Scotland are having to pay more for salt, they're having to pay more for food. Charles decides to put tax onto coal, so it costs more. So the poor of Scotland have to pay more money just to heat their houses. The houses in the tenements, they were cold, they were dark, they were damp. Child mortality was through the roof and nobody was helping. The Potterrow area of Edinburgh was from the back of Edinburgh University, or the back of where the National Museum is today, going south. It was quite a poor area. It was actually under the parish of Greyfriars Kirk. We've all been there with the Greyfriars Bobby story, and it's a lovely church. The church was built in 1620, one of the first churches built by the Kirk of Scotland. They built a lovely church and they built a lovely manse, and the minister sat in that manse. And did he go down to the tenements to care for the poor? No, he didn't. Why would he? Why would he want to go down there? He was too busy drinking claret in his fancy manse while the people in the Potterrow were dying of starvation. But they could go to Agnes, to her shop, to buy food. They could go to Agnes to get tick. They could go to Agnes for some help because the minister wasn't helping them. During the time that the poor of Edinburgh in the Potterrow were living, Charles I had a menagerie lots of kings had menageries at that time, and it was probably out near Christopher, near probably where Edinburgh Zoo is today. And he had a camel out there, and this camel had stables, and it had somebody to take care of it, and it had stable lads, and it was fed every day, I don't know, sugar lumps and honey and all sorts, and it got taken out for a walk, and everybody went to see the lovely camel of the king. And every so often, the groom would send a report to Charles about how the camel was getting on, and how many people had come to see it, and whether or not its stables were clean, and how many sugar lumps it had eaten, or something like this. At the same time, there was no report going from the Potter Row. Charles didn't receive a report about how the poor of Scotland were living, how many of them had died of malnutrition when the harvest failed, or how many had died in the cold winter because they couldn't afford anything. He didn't care about that, cared about his camel, but he didn't care about the Potter Row, but Agnes did. Agnes did care about the Potter Row, and she did have her shop. And yes, she argued with people, and yes, she laid curses on people. Well, so what? She was at least providing a service. But Agnes, although she was an awkward person, I think it was coming from a good place. At one point, her son-in-law was fined. He was a cordioner and a shoemaker, and he was fined by his guild for having been gotten a bit drunk on a Friday or Saturday night, and he'd brought the guild into disrepute, and they were fining him. Well, because of the fine he had to pay, he had no money to feed himself and Margaret, Agnes's daughter. Agnes did not take this lying down. Now, the society was very gendered. Agnes should have known her place. She should have been submissive to the men in her community, and Agnes went, absolutely not. She went round to see the deacon of the guild and demanded that he pull that fine back from her son-in-law. Now, an argument ensues. There was pushing and shoving. There might even have been some slaps exchanged. But the point was that Agnes throws this curse at the deacon and says, you know, you'll never prosper from here in a day. And apparently his business did fall away. Now, you might say, oh, that was terrible. Agnes threw a curse on this poor man and his business failed, and that's a terrible, wicked, witchy thing to do. But actually, she was defending her son-in-law, and she was defending her daughter, and she was trying to do what she could do within the society. Charles, at this time, is still arguing with his parliamentarians, and more things are happening. He's trying to impose the Anglican Episcopal faith onto Scotland, and the Scots are not having it. So a big riot kicks off, and the Scots decide to draft the National Covenant. And this was a covenant between the people of Scotland and God. And it was signed in the Greyfriars Kirkyard. It's all very grand, and all the great and the good of Scotland signed this fantastic covenant between the people of Scotland and the Lord God. Fantastic. Except, did that put food on the table of the poor of the Potter Row? No, it didn't, but Agnes did. Did that give people enough money to pay their rent? No, it didn't, but Agnes did. Did that allow them the money to heat their homes? No, it didn't, but Agnes did. And so it's almost as if the poor of Edinburgh, like the poor across Scotland, were living a parallel life. The ministers and the Privy Council and the councillors and the politicians and the king, they're having their squabbles about whether you have divine right of kings and what's the correct form of worship. Agnes is dealing with day-to-day matters like, can my neighbours afford to buy some herrings from me? She had arguments with neighbours over and over again, but they kept using her shop. Because although she was annoying and although she did yell at people, where else could they go? There was nothing else. The minister up in Greyfriars is thinking he's the greatest thing since sliced bread because the covenant has been signed in his kirkyard. But he never went near the tenements of the Potter Row to see how his parishioners were doing. If the parishioners did not go up to the kirk on Sunday, he would take a note of that. If the parishioners did not behave and their behaviour was outrageous and they were perhaps, I don't know, getting drunk on a Saturday night and having a sing-song, they could be reported about that and admonished and told they were wicked and told they were sinful. But nobody was helping them out when they were hungry or their children were ill. So Agnes continues to work in her neighbourhood. More and more politics is happening. Tensions are rising. The war starts to kick off. We have the Bishops' War in Scotland, and then the Second Bishops' War, and then the Civil War breaks out in England. And what happens? The country splits in two. Half the country supports the king, half the country doesn't support the king. There's young men being conscripted. People are frightened. People are not sure what's going on. And is the minister coming down to the tenements to help people, to care for the fact that they're under emotional stress? No, he's nowhere to be seen. Absolutely nowhere to be seen, because he's friends with all the high hegians up in the Privy Council. He doesn't care about the poor of the Potter Row. But Agnes did. And yes, she had arguments with her neighbours, and yes, she cursed her neighbours, and on several occasions she allegedly cursed her neighbours to death. It is up to you whether you believe she has those magical powers or not. But she was not doing anything out of the ordinary for witches right the way across Scotland and right the way across communities who were being abandoned by the great and the good. But now the war's kicked off, all of a sudden they care. All of a sudden the great and the good do care, because there's young boys in there that they can conscript into the army. There were merchants in Edinburgh who all of a sudden were dragging their sons along to the doctors, and the doctor would write a nice little note to say that, oh, well, he can't really actually fight in the war because he's got a bit of arthritis in his hands and he couldn't hold a rifle or a sword, or he can't ride a horse, or he's not very well. That wasn't happening in the Potter Row port. Young men were getting dragged away from their families, and their mothers had nowhere to go. Previously, the Catholic Church had the priesthood. You could go to the priest if you were in emotional distress. Now, your priest might not be very good at it, they might not be very helpful, but there was somewhere for you to go. You could go to your priest and say, I'm worried about my son. I'm worried about whether or not I can feed my children. I'm worried about whether or not I can pay my rent. The priest might say to you, pray to the Virgin or pray to one of the saints. And although that was not a practical solution, it at least gave you some sort of emotional redress against the stresses of being in poverty. The Kirk of Scotland comes along, the Reformation comes along, and they say, well, we'll have none of that. You don't pray to the saints, it's you and God, and that's it. And the minister is not there to give you emotional support. So where do you go for that emotional support? You go to the local witch, and the local witch gives you what she can. She might give you a charm to say. She might give you a little charm to say with a little object, a little amulet, a good luck charm to say. And with the greatest respect to anybody in the audience who may be of the Catholic faith, there isn't much difference between saying a charm with an amulet and saying a prayer holding a crucifix. It has the same emotional resonance, because the Kirk had just abandoned the poor. If you look at what happened before the Reformation, yes, of course, there were witches in communities, but nobody bothered about them, as long as they didn't kill anybody off. Nobody really, I mean, occasionally the priest would say, oh, you shouldn't really be a witch. But they weren't persecuting witches beforehand because there was no need. So these women and men who had practiced as witches for generations had done no harm. Their communities had not complained about them. Their neighbours had only ever gone when something really bad happened. So there was nothing happening there. They were part of the community in the same way as there would be a midwife or a miller or a blacksmith or a cobbler. They were part of that community. It is only when the Reformation comes in, and only when the Kirk of Scotland comes in, that they then take the devil and witches and put the two together, that they had never been put together before. And then by the middle of the 17th century, when the war kicks off and everybody is under stress and everybody is frightened, and the minister every single Sunday stands up and says, it's the devil, it's witches, it's the devil, it's witches. Well, it must be witches then, mustn't it? If you get that level of propaganda every single week in the pulpit. If you have the Kirk session who act as a morality code and tell you you mustn't dance and you mustn't sing and you must dress quietly and you must be quite modest in your behaviour if you're a woman, and Agnes wasn't. Agnes wasn't modest. Agnes and her neighbours used to have slanging matches in the street. yelling and screaming and bawling at each other. You're nothing but an old witch. Well, you're nothing but an old drunk. Admittedly, that does sound to me like Edinburgh on a Saturday night, but, you know, I'm biased. I'm from Glasgow. But the point is that was normal behaviour. We've all had arguments with our neighbours or our sisters or our siblings. I defy any of you to say that you've sat round a Christmas dinner table and not fallen out with somebody in your family. It's human nature. Agnes was a little bit more argumentative than most people, but not ridiculously so. She wasn't running about the streets attacking people. Most of the arguments that Agnes had, there was a cause for it. There was a reason for it. She wasn't just arguing for the sake of it. She might be arguing because somebody had said the herrings she sold weren't fresh. Or she might be arguing with somebody who had called her a witch in the street, which she knew was a death sentence. But she wasn't just arguing for arguing's sake. But as time goes on and the war in England, the civil war in England, spills into Scotland, there is even more tension and even more pressure put onto everybody in Scotland, but especially onto the poor. The price of food goes through the roof, and the poor can't feed themselves. The price of coal is now completely out with anybody's price range, so you end up doing something like burning dung. The tenements of Edinburgh, we've all been up to Edinburgh and seen the guides going up and down Edinburgh, and they'll say, oh, and they used to shout Gardyloo and throw things out the window and ha ha ha, and everybody laughs. It's disgusting. The poor were living in disgusting conditions and nobody was helping. Between 1620 and 1645, the minister in Greyfriars did not come down to ever visit in the Potter Row. I can find no note of that whatsoever. Things are building, pressures are building up. People are starting to call Agnes a witch. Agnes is realising that this is a death sentence. There are witches being burned down in Leith and other parts of Edinburgh. So things are building and building and building. At one point, Agnes is asked to care for a neighbour's child. And she does. And unfortunately, the little boy dies. But what Agnes did in that situation was exactly what a doctor would have done. The child appears to have had some sort of spasticity in their legs, and Agnes cut the child in the buttocks to relieve that tension. And doctors will still today, if somebody has something like a spasticity in the muscles, they will form what's known as tenotomy, and they cut the tendons. So Agnes did exactly what a doctor would have done if any doctor would have ever gone to the Potter Row port, which they wouldn't have done. But this builds and builds and builds until in 1644, a chap called Henryson goes and complains about Agnes. And I don't understand this because I don't know where he came from, because I cannot find him. Agnes was arrested and she was charged with 20 counts of witchcraft. And there's a list of all of the names of all of the people that she's alleged to have either killed or maimed or blinded or cursed or whatever. And that chap's name isn't there. So I don't know who he was. He had no reason to complain about Agnes. He wasn't the Buchanans whose child had died. Fine, I can go and complain. He wasn't William Fairley whose son had died. I can go and complain. He appears from nowhere. Was it a setup? I'm not sure. Anyway, all of a sudden the minister, Gillespie, thinks, oh, flip, I've got a witch in my neighbourhood. Which is sort of good if you're a minister, because it proves you're godly. It proves the devil is attacking you. And all of a sudden, though, he has to actually care about what's happening in the Potter Row. And all of a sudden, excuse me, the bailies get involved. And so there's a local bailey called John Elias, who apparently was the bailey for the Potter Row port and had been for years. So they go down and they arrest Agnes and they drag her off to interrogate her. But what I find interesting about the Elias character is that Agnes is supposed to have been a witch for about 28 years. If she's been doing all these terrible, wicked, awful things for 28 years, in the middle of the street apparently, how is this chap John Elias never seen anything? didn't see a thing, and now she's arrested. The minister, all of the ministers that had been in Greyfriars Kirk, didn't see anything until she gets arrested. And so Agnes is arrested and she's chucked in the toll booth. And now they have a problem because they have no proof. Now, normally, a witch would be arrested, say, on a Monday, tortured for a couple of days, go to trial on the Wednesday, be found guilty straight away, and she'd probably be executed on the Friday. They take Agnes in and she refuses to confess. And now they have a problem because it's her word against everybody else's word and saying, oh, it's fine, we've got, got lots of complaints against her. And Agnes turns around and gets herself a couple of lawyers, in which case the courts have a real problem because the courts are just going to say, there's no proof of this. So it's really unusual. So they spend ages with Agnes in prison and they don't bring her to trial. At one point, Agnes actually complains about the fact that she wasn't brought to trial. Eventually, they do bring her to trial, and they don't really have a lot of evidence against her. And her lawyers are saying, well, that's just hearsay, or that's just somebody's word against this and that. The next thing. Now, I've never read a trial record where there are 20 charges of witchcraft and the person gets off with it. So you would think the jury are going to spend a bit of a trial, bit of back and forth, and then the jury are going to go guilty within a day. The trial finishes and the jury goes away and they wait for a day and they wait for a week and then for a fortnight and then for a month, and they spend ages, absolutely weeks and weeks and weeks, debating whether or not Agnes was actually a witch and was guilty of witchcraft. And I still don't understand why not. The Witchcraft Act was actually very curiously worded. It was very badly worded, but it's very curiously worded in that, strictly speaking, being a witch was not a crime. Committing witchcraft was, but being a witch itself was not a crime. Now, the thing is that the Act was drafted in 1563, probably by John Knox, when Mary was still on the throne. And I think there was pushback because everybody knew there were witches. Of course there were witches. So I think that's why it's worded very, very strangely. And it might be a reason why, this is pure speculation, but it might be the reason why it took the jury so long to actually convict Agnes, because they're saying things like, well, we know she's a witch, but she's been a witch for ages. Why are we convicting her now? So they could convict her of doing witchcraft, but not actually of being a witch. But the problem with the let's convict her for doing witchcraft is, how do you prove witchcraft? Because it is a magical crime. If I look at one of you on the screen and after this talk you fall over and twist your ankle, was that my fault? Did I give you a funny look? Did I curse you? Did I say, oh, it's absolutely awful, I came on here and they couldn't get people in from the lobby, it's a disgrace, I'm going to curse Sheila. And Sheila later on has a headache. Is that me? Did I curse it? Did I cause that? That's a very difficult thing to actually prove. And so that's why I think they spent a real long time trying to convict Agnes. But eventually they did. And I'm not going to say spoiler alert, she was convicted and she was sentenced to be executed, which was to be worried to death and her dead body burnt. But one last thing about Agnes, which I just love, I think is a fantastic thing, is that most witches, I mean, you couldn't speak in the trial. Agnes doesn't get to speak in her trial. At the very end, when they pronounce sentence on her, and they say to her, you're guilty and we're going to sentence you. For some reason, it's written down, Agnes stands up fully in the court and says, I am a witch. And I'm a rank witch and have been for 28 years. And a rank witch meant a noble witch. I believe that Agnes was a witch. But I believe that she was a witch with her understanding of what that word meant. She was a magical practitioner. She was able to curse people. She was able to cure people. She was able to help people, but she had a temper. If you didn't pay her back, if you owed her money, then there could be consequences. I do not believe that she worshipped the devil. I don't believe that less than 1% of 1% of those who were arrested as witches believed in the devil. There would have been some, of course there would have been some, but I genuinely believe it would have been less than 1% of 1%. The trial records that say, yes, I met the devil beside the lug at Brig, or yes, I met the devil down at the docks, that's what the interrogators wrote down. We always have to be careful when you're reading the trial records, because the minister and the Kirk session and the interrogators and the lawyers are asking leading questions. They wouldn't say something like, did you meet the devil? Because you might say, no, I didn't. They would say, when you met the devil. Was Sheila also there? Was your sister Margaret always there? That's the way they asked the questions. And of course, they wrote down the answers. And we have actually no idea what witches actually said. And if they have taken somebody that they have kept awake day after day after day and burnt them with candles and pulled them about and beaten them and held them up in shackles and chained them and not fed them, who knows what they were saying? Who knows what they were saying? And that's where it's interesting. What's curious about Agnes is one of the big 4 proofs of being a witch was the devil's mark. They never tested Agnes for the devil's mark, possibly because of her personality. She probably would have fought them, and good for her. But that's the thing, that when you're reading these trial records, it can be read in so many ways. You can read statements like, I met the man in the green hat. To me, that's fairy belief. That is a genuine belief in the fairies. To the Kirk, it was proof they'd met the devil. The fairies were real. They were part of Scottish cultural society. You get fairies and people like that right the way across Europe. It's part of our cultural heritage, which the Kirk demonised and turned into these diabolical creatures that either they were imps and helpers of the devil, or they were a delusion of the devil. And that's where the interrogation of Agnes is so interesting, because they say to Agnes, you said you were a witch. And Agnes said, no, I did not. I said other people call me a witch. Agnes was not stupid. She knew how to defend herself. And that's the saddest part of it. Agnes was an intelligent woman. She was a bad-tempered old so-and-so, absolutely, but she was an intelligent woman living in a man's world. She was somebody who was a witch, but to her, that was somebody who helped her community, who used her magical powers. And yet she was living in a time when the Kirk had taken that and twisted it and made it into devil worship. She was living in a time when the great and the good of Edinburgh didn't give a monkey's about the poor of Edinburgh. Like they didn't care about the monkeys of anybody. They didn't care about the poor of anybody in Scotland. She was living in a time when the covenant is fantastic and we're all live with God and we've got a covenant with Christ and it's all very fantastic, but you can still watch your 2-month-old baby starve to death. That was the reality. And then the wars start to kick off and the Civil War kicks off and you watch your elderly mother freeze to death over a Scottish winter. That was the reality that Agnes was living in. She wasn't Lady Beneficent going round the neighbourhood helping everybody by just throwing largesse in their way, but she was helping them. She was being the doctor that they did not have. She was being the midwife they did not have. She was being the bank they did not have. She was being the food supplier that they did not have, because the great and the good didn't care. The Potter Row up to the Scottish Parliament, the old Scottish Parliament where the Privy Council sat, is maybe a 25-minute walk. It was a world away, an absolute world away. Some of the girls from the Potter Row might have gone up to places, merchants' houses, up at the top end of Edinburgh and cleaned, but they would have been on their hands and knees scrubbing stone floors, while men walked past carrying goblets of claret, thinking nothing of it. They would be earning pennies if they were lucky, whilst the great and the good had gold rings on their fingers and were busy seeing which way the wind was blowing and whether or not they should be a royalist or a covenanter. The religious zeal of the Kirk was genuine, And I understand that they genuinely thought that the devil was out there to get them. I accept that. And that explains their behaviour. It does not excuse their behaviour. It does not excuse them dragging Agnes out of her house all the way up to a filthy, dirty cell and keeping her there for weeks on end and abusing her. It does not excuse the thousands of other people who were arrested, and not just those that were arrested. I know that the numbers are a bit slippery because obviously some trial records will have gone missing and some records will have gone missing along the way. Let's say the figure is as high as 6,000. That's somebody's daughter. That's somebody's son. That's somebody's mother. That's somebody's sister. If you extrapolated those figures today, it would be the equivalent of around 36,000 people today in Scotland being accused of a crime. That would be 36,000 families and friends and communities terrorised by what the Kirk was doing. The politicians get in on the act by trampling over ordinary people and their beliefs, the likes of Agnes, whilst not providing the services that they should have done. Now, I'm not saying that they should have had an NHS at that point. Would have been interesting, but it would have been fine. But for the minister in the Kirk, for the minister in Greyfriars to not even get off his fat backside and go down and see how the poor were living is outrageous. For the king to be putting tax onto salt and coal that starved people to death and made them freeze in the winter was outrageous. For them to only come down to the Potter Row when they wanted young men to fight in their war and die in their stupid war that they had kicked off was outrageous. And yet it's Agnes that gets blamed. Whilst Agnes was allegedly being a witch, there was a woman called Margaret Mitchelson, and she was wandering up and down the high street of Edinburgh, saying that she saw visions of the covenanting Christ. Now, one of the questions always asked to witch suspects was, had you seen the devil? Did you see the devil? When you saw the devil, what was he dressed like? And what was he doing? Diddly-dum, right? And you might say, I met the man in the green hat, or I met the man with the black cape on. And instantly, you are a witch. Instantly, you are a devil worshipper. Instantly, you are put to death. Margaret Mitchison wanders up and down, having visions of the covenanting Christ. But that vision is acceptable. A witch's vision of seeing a man in a green hat is a death sentence. Margaret Mitchison's vision of seeing the covenanted Christ means she is feted throughout the whole of Edinburgh, and the great and the good take her into her house and they all go round to see her and listen to her visions. And that's the point. The Kirk had decided what was acceptable and what was not, which again, I understand why they did that, because they were frightened of the devil. But it does not excuse what they did. The other bogeyman in all of this is the Scottish law courts. They should never have allowed the Kirk to take over the way they did. The law said you were innocent until proven guilty. The law said you could not be arrested if you were under the age of 12 or if you were addled in your wits. The law said torture could only apply except in very, very narrow circumstances. And yet the lawyers threw the rule book out. The ministers took over. There was an old woman down in Leith who was arrested at one point. She was a very elderly lady and she was addled in her wits. Her family got a doctor to write out a letter to the court to say she is addled in her wits. That letter was presented to the court. The minister picked the letter up and ripped it up and said, I don't care, I want her brought in. And she was brought in and she was tortured. And the lawyers allowed that to happen. They allowed the Kirk to push them and shove them and bully them into this nonsense. And I know that because James had gone down to England, and I know that because Charles I and Charles II, I know all of the royals were down there, and it left a bit of a power vacuum in Scotland. And the Kirk stepped into that power vacuum. But the law courts, the justice system, the lawyers should have stood their ground, and they did not. And they allowed the persecution of women like Agnes. And so her case is important. She's not a kindly character. She's not a sympathetic character. She's not a sweet little old lady. She's an ordinary woman with a bit of a bad temper, but who should never have been treated the way she was. And after Agnes was executed, well, of course, it's going to be a happy ending, isn't it? The minister from Greyfriars Kirk is going to come down and he's going to sort out the poor, isn't he? And there's going to be a doctor brought in, and they're going to make sure that the children have got enough to eat, and that the old people have got coal for their fires so they don't freeze in the winter, aren't they? No, of course not. They never appeared again. John Elias went back to work and nobody said a thing. Gillespie, the minister, he got promoted up to being in the High Kirk of Scotland, so he doesn't care. Nobody went back to see the poor. Nobody actually went back and thought, oh, right, so the witch arose because circumstances were really bad and the neighbourhood needed some help. Maybe we should put some help in. No, absolutely not. It was a case of, we've got your witch, we've executed your witch, now get back to your poverty, we don't care. And that, unfortunately, was a pattern that was repeated across Scotland. Not to end on too negative a note. Things did get better, we know that. The justice system grew a backbone and started to push back. The Kirk started to calm down a bit. The politics calmed down a little bit. And so everybody could take a bit of a breather. Maybe the devil wasn't quite out to get us. And so the Witchcraft Act gets repealed, although the Kirk afterwards said that they still believed in witches and witchcraft. But what I find most poignant about people like Agnes and the others who are persecuted is the lack of any recognition as to the horror, the terror, the sheer abysmal situation that these people were put in just for being themselves. Agnes wasn't flying about on a broomstick. She wasn't turning her neighbour into a toad. She wasn't becoming great wealthy. She didn't have pots of gold under her bed. If she had these amazing magical powers, why wasn't she rich and living up in a posh bit of Edinburgh? She wasn't. She was an ordinary woman doing ordinary things. And for that, she was used and abused and executed. But to end on a positive note, what we have today is organisations like RAWS and others, and people like yourselves, who are retelling these stories and giving these people back the dignity that was taken from them, and giving them back the respect that they deserve, even though, as I say, our Agnes was a bit of a so-and-so, but she was a real person like you and I, and was deserving of the dignity that all human beings deserve. Thank you.